Hello and welcome to Rauta. I am Jerry and this is the black metal from Norway since the 90s, episode 20. Now what seemed to be first a short crash course through the bands that started in the 90s or even before that in terms of Norwegian black metal turned out to be its 20 and more episodes. But towards the end we go and as you can pretty much figure it out, we're not talking about the big names now. They were in the early episodes, I and the Pie, episode 20. We're talking about those really unknown bands, the ones that are almost extinct in terms of, activity and all. But since there are some bands which have more than just a demo tape out or more than an EP and actually a few albums, this time we have three bands which have something in common. These are all the bands I didn't get to hear back in the 90s or even early 2000s. For some reason or another, these kind of escape going under the radar, so to speak, back in the days. Why? Well, I guess we'll find out, and I'll share you my comments along the way, what I feel about these albums now, and make a wild guess, an educated one, about how I could have felt about these bands and albums back in the days. As with the previous episode, let's start with the oldest one first and then move on with the list. First, Morgul. Now this is not the only Morgul named band found on Metal Archives, but this is the only Norwegian one. And pretty interesting is that this started as early as 1990, even with a different name, but 1991 with Morgul. Now you have to bear in mind that bands, even big ones like Dimmu Borgir and the like, they didn't they didn't exist even in 1991. Well, technically speaking, neither did Morgul that much because Vari Winter, Wolf Winter, came out in 1994 and the first album as late as 1997. I'm saying as late because you now have to understand that even though nowadays it feels like, hey, it's more than 25 years old, we are talking about 1990s black metal. By 1991, there were obviously bands like Darkthrone, Mayhem, Burzum, etc. out there, and by 1997, the whole wave had their own subwave of things. I mean, the first one started early 90s and before that, and by 1997, there was lots of bands coming out there, even multiple albums, sorry. Anyway, so in that respect, while Morgul seems to be quite old and could have been right there early in the beginning, it took quite a few years to finally come to a full album length, and 1997 was when it started. This is a curious one because Jack the Ripper, as the artist name here goes, seemed to do pretty much everything by himself. That includes vocals, guitars, bass, keyboards, and now you don't see drums. Well, if you click for past members, you will see that originally there was a drummer Hex in 1991 to 1999, which leads us to the very interesting thing that the early albums actually sound better in terms of drumming, especially because, well, they had real drummer. Now, this is something that I didn't pay attention the lineup thing, that is when I was listening to these albums, because like I said, this was my virgin trip through all of these 5 albums. 5 albums within less than 10 years, so quite active all in all. What is curious, however, that in so many ways this is a kind of a typical bedroom black metal project, especially the later years when only one man is taking care of everything. And as much as I would like to say, yes, this band progressed, it went through evolution of things and, became better over years, I'm kind of like on the other way. Now, I've described a lot of discographies with various letters. Like you start up very nicely, then you fall down, only to come back, or sometimes it's more like V. Then there are bands which go straight line like I, starting up and going down. This is what I really feel about Emperor, for instance. But what I would say about Morgul is like, it's more like a dash. Slowly going down, like pure decline all the way. Which leads us to the very first album, Lost in Shadow's Grave from 1997. Now this album is nothing out of ordinary coming from mid or late 90s. I mean, it's synthesizer field. It's kind of a melodic, it's very typical black metal. It's not the rawest out there, nor it's the most symphonic, but kind of something in the middle of the road. It's not avant-garde-ish, but something like you would say a typical Norwegian black metal album, or black metal of the time, that era. And that's actually pretty good. I was surprised, like, hey, this is an album I totally missed back in the days, and this is actually pretty much something that, stood against a test of time. Now, this kind of reminds me, some other bands, like Covenant's debut album. It's actually Poor Man's version of Debut Emperor, but, it's pretty solid for what it is. And there are plenty of bands you could talk about in a similar sentence, like bands like Troll or Gehenna, Ancient maybe even. So not the fastest, not the rawest, not the most symphonic, and definitely not the weirdest. Kind of average middle of the road band, which is exactly something for most people, like, yeah, I'm looking for this kind of stuff when we're talking about Norwegian black metal. As such, I still would say, yeah, it's worth a listen, it's pretty good. Now, when it came for the time for the second album, Parody of the Mass, it started going a little bit weird. I mean, this is an album which basically continues from the first album, then tosses some melodic death metal parts in the mix, or even just death metal parts, and then it gets like, why did you want to go that way? But then you're like, okay, but, musicians have to evolve, they have to challenge themselves, and they don't want to repeat themselves. I mean, there are two kinds of artists, let's be honest about it. Those who want to stick to the very silver gold vein they found and stick to it. Amon Amarth is a typical example of that band, or Judas Priest or Iron Maiden. And then there are bands who are like, let's change the course of action and style every few albums. You could drop names from Burzum to Darkthrone to, well, even to a certain degree, Emperor, and definitely for Enslaved. So this is not something that this is necessarily destroys the quality, but means that the band is always changing, always going for different routes, and sometimes it goes for the wrong way. I would say Parody of the Mass is like the lesser version of Lost in Shadows Grey. So in hindsight, it feels like Lost in Shadows Grey is kind of like, say, the perfected version of the Parody album. I mean, more like, it's like if Parody was a demo tape, Lost in Shadows Grey was like, now we are back into the focus and let's just remove the extra stuff and make it worthwhile. But unfortunately, they went this way. And when the Her Grandeur came in 2000, I mean, it was kind of typical of the time. Now you're expecting more changes. Let's add avant-garde. I mean, after all, Arcturus or other bands went for these guys. Some bands went for, avant-garde things, some went for circus music, Vedbuens End or whatever, Dödheimsgard experimental and all that stuff, and suddenly it's like totally different thing. And then you're like, now they are losing their marbles, they are just kind of abandoning black metal for what? In order to experiment more with the music. I get it, you're one man and you want a one-man band and you want to just do whatever you please, because there's nobody to stop you. But in the process, you're kind of like losing it. You're losing the focus, and it's less of black metal, more something else. Now, the same thing happened with Sketch of Supposed Murderer. I find this album to be kind of a mess. To be honest, really mediocre album. Not bad, but it's almost like, okay, now you don't have the real drummer anymore, and you're doing, like here you get to see it, it's just Jack the Ripper. There is like violin as a guest musician, and then there are other stuff mentioned at stuff, but let's be honest about it. This is an album where you just go deeper, the Her Grandeur album, and you're like, I'm gonna experiment a little bit more. But now it's more like electronics in the mix even. So you're like going farther and farther away from black metal you started with, and going with electronics, avant-garde ideas, and etc. And I'm like, yeah, this is definitely not for me. Then again, I wasn't really ever a fan of, Arcturus' early album, or when Ulver or Vedbuens Ended, whatever, decided to do like, hey, let's go crazy and let's just abandon the traditional black metal. And what ended with 2005 album All Dead Here is pretty much like a direct continuation to the previous one. So I'm saying like the band was, in my opinion, going for the wrong direction all the time. It's almost like it weakened album by album. First losing the drummer, then getting more into avant-garde-ish, then getting more into experimental ideas and you name it, electronics. And as such, we haven't really heard from the band since 2006. Maybe it is because here it says that the musician himself moved to USA later on. Maybe that changed the life and the course of action. To be honest, it's not like I'm gonna miss the band. But still, saying Lost in Shadows Grey is definitely worth giving a shot if you like traditional 1990s black metal. If you like the different kind, then go for the latter ones. The second band in question, also now unknown status, is Enthral from Norway, founded in 1995, consequently also doing their first album in 1997. Now, this is not as weird as the Morgul case later on, but kind of the middle road band all the way through with its 4th album. Now, mind you, this came as late as 2012 with their latest album, but it's still unknown what's happening with the band nowadays. I mean, there was 9 years gap between the 2 latest albums, even though the early albums came kind of back to back and all that stuff. Now, I'm not gonna go into details with all these 4 different albums or even the EP in the middle, because this, to be honest, luckily didn't change too much. Now, it's just unfortunate that their very middle of the road, run-to-the-mill kind of a black metal is in fact quite forgettable. It's not so much like it's bad. It's more like they didn't really hit the nails with, good songwriting. It's almost like you have here good riff and another good riff there, and the rest is like some kind of a melodic experimentation with not really going for extremes, not in the sense of melodies, not in the sense of rawness, not really adding good layers of symphonic elements, so it's kind of like in the middle in so many ways, both in quality as well as the style. Now, this might sound like a safe black metal bet, and in a way it is. The only problem is they do not have the killer songs, and even less so killer albums. So when people go for like 80% or 95% here, I'm like, yeah, fine. For me, it's more like 60, maybe 70% at best. There are some really good riffs, individual ones. I remember when I was going these Prophecies of the Dying album, and there was like one riff could be like raising my eyebrows and like thinking, this could be a good Dark Throne riff. There's one thing I want to mention, however, before we move on to the last band, is that these albums are lengthy as hell. And that's part of the problem. When you have songs averaging like 11 minutes, it's like you have to be really genius in order to make that work really, really good for most of the audience. 6 songs lasting more than 60 minutes. Come on, that's more than 10 minutes on average. The same or similar thing is with the second album. 74 minutes throughout 9 tracks. I mean, surely there are some tracks, couple of them, which are around 2 minutes. But the rest of them is 8, 11, 9, 8, almost 14 minutes. And I'm like, really? You don't make songs like that work very well unless you are songwriting genius. 14 minutes is challenging for any kind of a songwriter to make it like, yeah, this is a elite track. And like I said, the similar pattern except with this album, which is only 47 minutes and not too many lengthy tracks. But here again, once again, the Obtinerate album, again, going more than 60 minutes, almost 70. So I'm saying this is part of the problem with this one. When you have the kind of a basic songwriting and then you just like overload it with more than 60 minutes of an album, it becomes a drag. So I'm not saying this is a bad band, but it's very, very forgettable. Now, remember when in the beginning of the video I said I would have guessed how I feel about these bands later on. Well, for Morgul, I could probably love the first album because I was less critical about the quality and all back in the days. But this kind of stuff, this wouldn't have never, worked for me too well. So unfortunately, kind of a middle of the road band in so many ways, and as such, unfortunately, quite forgettable. Then the last and also the weirdest of the bands in this list is Source of Tide, which started also after mid-90s, 1996, with the 1997 debut album Dawn of Tides. Source of Tide is actually a band that basically is borderline to be on the list here. Now, to be honest, I don't know why it's labeled as melodic black metal, because to be honest, actually these 2 first albums are more like melodic death metal ones with just some black metal seasoning. The thing here is they are quite a stretch to call them black metal to begin with. it's not so much about quality, it's more like the songwriting and the feeling, which is, in my opinion, kind of a borderline black metal. Now remember that back in the 90s, even bands like Dissection were not always considered pure black metal, but more like melodic death or death black. Source of Tide, in my opinion, is way more clearly on the melodic death metal side of things rather than black metal. And when it comes to their third album, Blueprints, now this isn't melodic death metal or even less black metal. This is more like an experimental take on metal. It's more like the band by this time had already abandoned whatever they were doing with the early albums. So calling it black metal in general, not even focusing on individual selections here, is, to be honest, quite a stretch. To be honest, maybe I wouldn't even have picked it for the list or this video series at all, unless I had already added it on the list before, planning how this series would go out. Then again, it's also fair to include this one because here it is labeled as black metal, and some people might then again ask me later on, why is this band not on your video series? Because it's labeled as black metal. But now you know. To be honest, if you're looking for a Norwegian black metal band, you can totally ignore Source of Tide with good conscience. You don't have to worry about it if you don't include it, because it doesn't really sound like black metal one. When it comes to musical quality of more like this melodic death metal style, I would still say it's mediocre at best. To be honest, if you have to listen to something, go for the Dawn of Tides, and then it goes much like Morgul, in decline and slowly kind of becoming more like obnoxious really than enjoyable band with the Blueprints album. It's not like I hate it, but I feel like I'm never going back to it. Now, best of the pile, if I had to pick one band of these trio, would be Morgul with the first album, which you probably guessed so far. But this is not so much in comparison about one another and all, more like to give you a little bit of idea what kind of underground black metal you might have missed back in the days, or especially if you're younger generation and not old fart like me who grew up with more or less 1990s kind of stuff. So these are all bands that I didn't hear back in the days, and now that I heard them, I feel like I didn't miss a thing. But this is my take. You figure out yours, of course, naturally, and figure out which one works for you. All the links for Metal Archive site for these bands are in the description box, so you can click for them or just use your magical Googling skill or favorite streaming service to listen to the music. For example, every album by Morgul, except for the last one, I listened to them on Spotify and the last one on YouTube. Enthral was more or less, everything was on Spotify, and for Source of Tide, I think the last album only was on Spotify, and the rest I listened to on YouTube. The quality might not be right there. For example, I gotta say that it was kind of sad that for Enthral's, I think the latest album, or then it was the Subterranean Movement, which wasn't on Spotify, and the sound quality on YouTube was bad. So it's probably ruining a little bit of my experiment with the or experience with the band, rather than if I had heard it like proper quality, because it seemed like this was some bad low quality rip of an album instead of doing the right way. But sometimes it is what it is, and of course you can still figure out the songwriting despite what the quality is. But now off you go. If you want to listen to them, just click on the links and start listening, or use your magical typing skills with your smartphone or computer, whatever you're using, and start exploring. Now we have still a few more bands left for this series, but now mostly non-album bands. So expect more diving into the world of deep end underground or Norwegian black metal before the whole series is done. Looking forward to your comments and suggestions and recommendations if you have something in your mind. Now off you go and enjoy.